On the morning of March 6, 1944, something happened over the skies of Berlin that made the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany realize his air force was doomed. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had built the Luftwaffe from nothing into the most feared air force. On Earth, he had promised Adolf Hitler that no enemy bomb would ever fall on German soil. He had sworn that if a single British aircraft reached the Ruhr industrial heartland, the German people could call him Meyer instead of Göring, a German expression meaning he would eat his own words. In the early years of the war, that boast had seemed justified. The Luftwaffe had crushed Poland in days, shattered France in weeks, and fought the Royal Air Force to a standstill over the English Channel. But on that cold March morning, when his staff officers rushed into his headquarters with reports that American fighter planes had been spotted directly over the German capital, Göring refused to believe them. He screamed at his generals. He accused his own pilots of lying. He demanded to know how single-engine fighters could possibly fly from England to Berlin and back. The distance was over 1,100 miles. Every aviation expert in Germany had calculated that such a mission was physically impossible. A single-engine fighter simply could not carry enough fuel to fly that far and still have the weight and performance to fight. Yet the reports kept coming. Sleek silver aircraft with distinctive checkered nose markings were diving through formations of German interceptors, shooting them out of the sky with devastating precision. These were not the short-range P-47 Thunderbolts that German pilots had learned to outlast by flying deeper into the Reich. These were not the twin-engine P-38 Lightnings that could be outmaneuvered in a turning fight. These were something new, something faster, something that stayed with the American bombers all the way to the target and all the way home again. They were P-51 Mustangs. And their appearance over Berlin that day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's control of its own airspace. 2 days after the war ended in Europe, on May 10, 1945, American General Karl Spaatz sat across from a defeated Hermann Göring in a schoolhouse in Augsburg, Germany. Spaatz had commanded the entire United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe. Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg was there, along with aviation pioneer Alexander de Seversky, and the official historian of the Strategic Air Forces. They wanted to know exactly when Göring realized the Luftwaffe had lost control of the skies. Göring's answer was direct and specific. He told Spaatz that when American long-range fighters were able to escort bombers as far as Hanover, he knew they would soon reach Berlin. And when they did reach Berlin, he knew the results would be tragic for Germany. The word he used in that interrogation, recorded in the official United States Air Forces in Europe intelligence summary, was tragic. That single word, spoken by a broken man awaiting trial for war crimes, captured a truth that had taken the Luftwaffe completely by surprise. The Americans had done what German intelligence officers had calculated was physically impossible. They had built a single-engine fighter that could fly over 1,600 miles, engage in combat at 30,000 feet, and return home with fuel to spare. And that fighter had just rendered every assumption of German air defense obsolete in a single catastrophic morning. The popular version of Göring's statement, often quoted as "the day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up," is actually a paraphrase that evolved through decades of aviation history literature. The documented interrogation records show that Göring used the word tragic, but the meaning was the same. The appearance of long-range escort fighters over the German capital told him that everything his air force had been built to do was now impossible. The P-51 Mustang was born from an audacious promise made in the desperate spring of 1940. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped from Dunkirk, but most of its equipment lay abandoned on French beaches. The Royal Air Force was bleeding pilots faster than it could train replacements. The Battle of Britain was about to begin, and every aircraft counted. British purchasing agents travelled to California hoping to convince North American Aviation to build Curtiss P-40 fighters under license. The P-40 was not a great aircraft, but it was available, and the British needed fighters immediately. They would take anything with guns and an engine, but James Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, had other ideas. His company had never built a fighter aircraft before. They were known for trainers and observation planes, but Kindleberger believed his engineering team could design something better than the P-40 in the same amount of time it would take to set up a licensed production line. His chief designer, a largely self-taught German-born engineer named Edgar Schmued, backed him up with characteristic confidence. Schmued told Kindleberger not to let them build an obsolete airplane. "Let us build a new one," he said. The British Purchasing Commission was skeptical but desperate. They gave North American 120 days to deliver a flying prototype. What happened next became one of the great engineering achievements of the Second World War. Schmued and his team worked around the clock, 7 days a week. They incorporated revolutionary design features that were years ahead of contemporary fighters. The wing used a laminar flow airfoil developed by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, designed to reduce drag by maintaining smooth airflow over a greater portion of the wing surface. The radiator system was mounted in a ventral scoop that exploited what engineers call the Meredith effect, using the heat from the cooling system to accelerate exhaust air and actually generate thrust. The result was an aircraft with the lowest drag coefficient of any fighter in the war, just 0.0176. The prototype, designated NA-73X, rolled out of the Inglewood factory on September 9, 1940. Depending on how the contract timeline is measured, the team had completed the aircraft in somewhere between 102 and 117 days, an astonishing achievement by any standard. It flew for the first time on October 26th. The British Purchasing Commission got their fighter, and it was everything Kindleberger and Schmued had promised. The aircraft that emerged was beautiful and wickedly fast. At low altitudes, it outperformed every American fighter then in production. The Mustang Mark I, as the British designated it, was 30 miles per hour faster than the P-40, and more than 70 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire Mark V at 10,000 feet. Test pilots reported excellent handling and visibility. The aircraft was a joy to fly, but the original Mustang had a fatal limitation that would take 2 years to solve. Its Allison V 1710 engine used a single-stage supercharger that could not deliver adequate power at high altitudes. Superchargers compress incoming air to maintain engine power as atmospheric pressure drops with altitude. The Allison's single-stage design worked well, up to about 12,000 feet. Above 15,000 feet, performance dropped off catastrophically. By 20,000 feet, the Mustang was slower than a Messerschmitt 109 and could barely climb. The aircraft was brilliant for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack missions, but it was useless as a high-altitude escort fighter. And high-altitude escort was the one thing the Allied bomber forces would soon need more desperately than anything else. The answer came from an unlikely source, a test pilot with connections in the right places. On April 30th, 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker flew a borrowed Mustang at the Royal Air Force Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford. He was immediately impressed by its speed and handling at low altitude, but he noticed the same limitation everyone else had seen. Above 15,000 feet, the Allison engine simply ran out of breath. Harker was not just any test pilot. He had direct connections to the engineering division at Rolls-Royce, the company that built the legendary Merlin engine. Within 48 hours of his test flight, he had contacted the company's experimental department with a radical proposal. What if they replaced the Allison engine with a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61? The Merlin 61 was the same two-stage, two-speed, supercharged engine that was transforming the Spitfire Mark IX into a high-altitude champion capable of matching the latest German fighters. It produced over 1,300 horsepower and maintained that power at altitudes where the Allison was gasping for air. If the Merlin could be fitted into the Mustang airframe, Harker believed, the result would be the finest fighter in the world. Ernest Hives, the general manager of Rolls-Royce, who effectively ran the company's wartime operations, authorized the conversion immediately. Engineers at the company's Hucknall facility set to work modifying a Mustang airframe to accept the larger, heavier British engine. The challenges were significant. The Merlin was longer than the Allison and required a redesigned engine mount. The cooling system had to be reconfigured. The propeller needed to be replaced. The first modified aircraft, designated Mustang X, flew on October 13, 1942, just 5 months after Harker's original test flight. The transformation was almost beyond belief. The Merlin-powered Mustang achieved 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, faster than any production fighter then in service with any air force. Its service ceiling jumped above 40,000 feet. Where the Allison Mustang had struggled, the Merlin Mustang soared. The American version, powered by the Packard 1653, an American-built copy of the Merlin producing 1,380 horsepower with up to 1,600 at emergency war power, first flew on November 30th, 1942. The results confirmed everything the British tests had shown. The ugly duckling had become a swan, but one American champion deserves particular credit for pushing the Merlin Mustang program forward against bureaucratic resistance. Major Thomas Hitchcock Jr. served as the United States Assistant Military Air Attaché in London. He was a World War I fighter ace, a world-famous polo player, and a man with political connections that reached into the highest levels of the American government. When General Henry Arnold dismissed the British Merlin Mustang test data as merely estimated performance, Hitchcock went over his head. He wrote directly to Robert Lovett, the Assistant Secretary of War for Air, who had the political access to force the program forward. Hitchcock's letter included a prophetic observation. Sired by the English out of an American mother, he wrote, "The Mustang has no parent in the Army Air Corps to appreciate and push its good points." Hitchcock was killed on April 19, 1944, testing a Mustang in a high-speed dive over Salisbury, England, just weeks before D-Day. He never saw the victory he helped make possible. Even the Merlin engine was not enough to solve the escort problem completely. The Mustang needed range, enormous range, enough to fly from England to Berlin and back while still having fuel for extended combat. This required a second innovation that would prove just as critical as the engine swap. In July 1943, the United States Army Air Forces ordered all fighter manufacturers to maximize internal fuel capacity. North American engineers realized that the heavier Merlin engine had shifted the aircraft's center of gravity forward, creating space for an additional fuel tank behind the pilot's seat. They designed an 85-gallon tank that fit into the fuselage, increasing internal fuel capacity from 184 gallons to 269 gallons, an increase of 46%. The fuselage tank came with serious handling penalties. When full, it made the Mustang dangerously unstable, what pilots described as nothing resembling an airplane. The center of gravity shifted so far aft that the aircraft could snap into an uncontrollable spin with little warning. Standard operating procedure required burning down the fuselage tank first, then switching to external drop tanks, aiming to have no more than 40 gallons remaining in the fuselage when combat was expected. The external drop tanks were another critical innovation. American officers in the 8th Air Force, led by Colonel Cass Huff, developed a design for compressed paper drop tanks that were lighter and cheaper than metal tanks. The British firm Boater Lloyd manufactured them from laminated craft paper. Experts at Wright Field had declared paper tanks absolutely unfeasible, but by the time their report reached England, the 8th Air Force had already used over 15,000 of them without a single structural failure. With two 108-gallon drop tanks added to full internal fuel, the P-51D carried nearly 490 gallons of fuel and could fly over 1,600 miles. The comparison with other fighters was stark. A P-47 Thunderbolt burned approximately 260 gallons of fuel over 600 miles. The Mustang covered the same distance on 108 gallons. The Spitfire Mark 9 carried only about 102 gallons internally, barely enough fuel to reach the German border from English bases. The timing of these breakthroughs could not have been more critical. By the autumn of 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign over Germany had reached a crisis that threatened to end strategic bombing altogether. The doctrine that the bomber will always get through had been an article of faith among American air planners since the early 1930s. At the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama, instructors taught that formations of heavily armed bombers equipped with precision bomb sights could fight their way to any target without fighter escort. The bombers would defend themselves with interlocking fields of fire from their multiple gun positions. Enemy fighters that attacked the formation would be shot down faster than they could shoot down bombers. This doctrine was built on assumptions that combat would prove catastrophically wrong. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses in a double strike against two crucial targets in southern Germany. One force would hit the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg. The other would attack the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. Ball bearings were essential components in nearly every German weapon, from tanks to submarines to aircraft. American planners believed that destroying the Schweinfurt factories would cripple German war production. P-47 Thunderbolts and British Spitfires could escort the bombers only as far as the Belgian border, roughly 400 miles from England. Beyond that, the B-17s were on their own for more than 2 hours of flight, over heavily defended German territory. The fighter pilots called it the point of no escort. The bomber crews called it the beginning of hell. The result was a slaughter. German fighters, knowing exactly where the Allied escort would turn back, assembled in force just beyond that line. They attacked the undefended bomber formations with 20mm cannon fire and rockets. Wave after wave of Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs tore through the American formations. 60 B-17s were shot down in a single day. More than 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. Dozens more aircraft limped back to England so badly damaged they would never fly again. The bomber gunners believed they had inflicted devastating losses on the attacking Germans. They claimed 288 German fighters destroyed. The actual Luftwaffe losses were somewhere between 27 and 47 aircraft. The overclaiming ratio of roughly 7-1 revealed how badly the self-defending bomber concept distorted reality. Multiple gunners firing at the same attacking fighter each believed they had scored the kill. The arithmetic of defensive claims bore no relationship to actual German casualties. 2 months later, on October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt. The date would become known throughout the Army Air Forces as Black Thursday. 291 B-17s attacked the ball-bearing works. German fighters rose to meet them in even greater numbers than before. 60 bombers were shot down outright over Germany. 17 more were so badly damaged they were scrapped after landing in England. 121 additional aircraft required major repairs before they could fly again. In a single afternoon, the 8th Air Force had effectively lost 200 aircraft, nearly 70% of the attacking force, either destroyed or damaged. The 305th Bomb Group suffered the worst losses of any unit that day. They lost 13 of their 16 aircraft. 130 men from a single bomb group, 87% of the force they had launched that morning, were gone within hours. Across the entire 8th Air Force, the official history later acknowledged a brutal reality. The fact was that the 8th Air Force had for the time being lost air superiority over Germany. The mathematics of attrition made the situation clear. At a sustainable loss rate of approximately 5% per mission, bomber crews had roughly a 28% statistical chance of completing their required 25-mission combat tour. At the 16 to 26% loss rates of the Schweinfurt missions, no crew could statistically survive. In late 1943, only about 1/4 of 8th Air Force bomber crews actually completed their tours. The average operational lifespan of a B-17 in combat was 11 missions. The human cost was staggering. The 8th Air Force would ultimately lose more than 26,000 men killed in action over Europe. That figure exceeded the total combat deaths of the entire United States Marine Corps throughout the Pacific War. Bomber crews had the highest casualty rates of any American service branch except submarine crews. After Black Thursday, unescorted deep penetration raids into Germany were suspended. For nearly 5 months, American heavy bombers stayed away from targets in the German heartland. The entire strategic bombing campaign, which American war planners had promised would defeat Germany without the need for a ground invasion, hung in the balance. While American bomber crews were dying over Germany, the Luftwaffe was perfecting the art of destroying them. German fighter pilots had developed tactics specifically designed to defeat the supposedly self-defending bomber formations. In November 1942, 2 young German aces named Egon Meyer and Georg Peter Eder pioneered what they called the head-on attack. They discovered that the B-17's nose was its weakest defensive point. In early models, the nose was defended by only a single 30-caliber machine gun, far lighter than the 50-caliber weapons mounted elsewhere on the aircraft. Later, B-17s added a chin turret, but the forward defense remained relatively weak. Meyer and Eder developed a tactic where fighters approached from 12 o'clock high in tight V formations, diving at the bomber stream head-on. At combined closing speeds of 500 miles per hour, the defensive gunners had only seconds to track and engage before the attackers flashed past. The fighters poured cannon fire into the cockpit and nose area, killing pilots and bombardiers before they could react. After the first such attacks, 8th Air Force intelligence officers noted a change of enemy fighter tactics, with nearly all attacks being frontal. One aviation historian later concluded that from that moment, the B-17 was obsolete as a self-defending bomber. The Germans deployed increasingly specialized weapons against the bomber formations. The Werfer Granat 21 was a 210mm rocket with a 90-pound high-explosive warhead. Mounted on underwing rails, these weapons could be fired from beyond the effective range of bomber defensive guns. They were not particularly accurate against individual aircraft, but they were devastatingly effective at breaking up tight defensive formations. Once a formation scattered, individual bombers became easy prey for cannon-armed fighters. Later came the specialized Sturmbok assault units. These were Focke-Wulf 190A8s, fitted with extra armor plating around the cockpit and engine, and armed with 30mm Mk.108 cannon. The pilots who flew these heavily armored fighters signed contracts pledging to destroy at least one 4-engine bomber per mission, or to ram the bomber if their guns failed. On July 7, 1944, Sturmbok fighters destroyed an entire 12-plane squadron of B-24 Liberators from the 492nd Bomb Group in a single devastating pass. The man responsible for coordinating this defense was Adolf Galland, appointed General of Fighters in November 1941 at the age of 29. Galland was himself an ace, one of the most successful fighter pilots in German history, with approximately 94 confirmed aerial victories at the time of his appointment, and over 100 by war's end. He understood both the capabilities and the limitations of his pilots better than any staff officer in Berlin, and he understood immediately that long-range American escort fighters would change everything. But when Galland tried to warn the Luftwaffe High Command about the threat, he ran into a wall of denial that bordered on delusion. The official position, handed down from Göring himself, was that long-range single-engine fighters were technically impossible. American fighters might appear over the Western Reich temporarily, but they could not possibly escort bombers all the way to Berlin. The physics simply did not allow it. To understand how completely Göring failed to prepare for this moment, one must understand the man himself. Hermann Wilhelm Göring had been a fighter ace in the First World War, credited with 22 victories. After the Red Baron was killed in April 1918, Hauptmann Wilhelm Reinhard briefly commanded the famous Richthofen fighter wing until his death in a flying accident that July. Göring then took command as the unit's final wartime leader. He was wounded during the Munich Beer Hall Putsch in 1923 and became addicted to morphine during his painful recovery. That addiction would haunt him for the rest of his life. By 1939, Göring held more titles and more power than any other Nazi leader except Hitler himself. He was Reich Minister of Aviation, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan, controlling the German economy, President of the Reichstag, and Hitler's designated successor. He built an enormous art collection, much of it looted from conquered territories. He designed elaborate uniforms for himself and lived in palatial estates while his pilots died over Germany. His famous boast about bombs never falling on the Ruhr was made in September 1939, when German victory seemed inevitable. When British bombs inevitably did fall on German cities, civilians sarcastically renamed air raid sirens Meyer's trumpets. Göring reportedly once introduced himself as Meyer upon entering a Berlin air raid shelter during a bombing attack. The jest had become a bitter admission of failure. By early 1944, Göring's influence with Hitler was declining rapidly. The failures over Britain, the disaster at Stalingrad where he had promised to supply the encircled Sixth Army by air and delivered barely a third of the minimum required tonnage, and the ongoing inability to stop Allied bombers had eroded his standing. He retreated increasingly to his estates, indulging in paracodeine, a morphine substitute, while his air force crumbled. When P-47 Thunderbolts began appearing deeper and deeper over Germany in late 1943, Göring refused to accept the evidence of his own intelligence officers. The confrontation between Galland and Göring over this issue became one of the most documented episodes of command dysfunction in the entire war. When Galland reported to Hitler that American fighters had been shot down over Aachen, deep inside German territory, Göring summoned him to a train station and screamed at him in front of other officers. The Reichsmarschall's face turned red with fury. I officially give you an order that they were not there, Göring bellowed. Do you understand me? The American fighters were not there. Galland pointed out calmly that the wreckage of the shot-down American aircraft was physical proof they had been there. The debris was lying on German soil. German soldiers had examined the aircraft. The pilots had been captured. Göring suggested, apparently seriously, that perhaps the American fighters had been hit farther west and then glided east into Germany before crashing. Galland's response was devastating in its simplicity. Glided to the east, sir? The exchange captured the delusional thinking that left the Luftwaffe unable to prepare for the long-range escort threat until it was too late to respond effectively. In January 1944, 3 interconnected changes occurred that would transform the air war over Europe within a matter of months. First, General James Doolittle replaced Ira Eaker as commander of the 8th Air Force. Doolittle was already famous throughout America for leading the first air raid on Tokyo in April 1942, a mission that had boosted American morale at the lowest point of the Pacific War. He brought a fundamentally different philosophy to the bomber escort problem. Visiting 8th Fighter Command headquarters shortly after taking command, Doolittle noticed a sign on the wall that read, "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive." The sign reflected the defensive mentality that had governed fighter operations since the bombing campaign began. Fighters were to stay close to the bombers, protecting them from German attackers. Doolittle ordered the sign torn down immediately. In its place, he put a new sign with new orders. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. Major General William Kepner, the 8th Fighter Command Chief, was overjoyed. He had argued for years that fighters should be freed to hunt German aircraft aggressively rather than being tied to slow-moving bomber formations. He reportedly ripped down the old sign himself as Doolittle walked out of the room. Doolittle later called this change the most important and far-reaching military decision he made during the entire war. Second, growing numbers of Merlin-powered P-51 Mustangs began arriving at English bases in significant numbers. The 357th Fighter Group had been operational since February. The legendary 4th Fighter Group, whose pilots had originally flown with the Royal Air Force as American volunteers before Pearl Harbor, was transitioning from older P-47 Thunderbolts to the new Mustangs. Third, Doolittle freed the fighters from their defensive close escort role entirely. Instead of flying formation alongside the bombers, Mustangs and other escorts could now range ahead of the bomber stream, hunting German fighters at altitude, diving down to strafe airfields and railway lines, and engaging the enemy wherever they could find them. The bombers would still be protected, but they would be protected by fighters that went looking for a fight rather than waiting for one. The bombers, in effect, became bait in a deliberate trap. German fighters that rose to attack the bomber formations would find American fighters waiting for them with advantages of altitude and surprise. The test of this new aggressive doctrine came in late February 1944. During Operation Argument, which participants and historians came to call Big Week, from February 20th through the 25th, the 8th Air Force launched more than 3,800 bomber sorties against German aircraft factories, while the Royal Air Force struck the same targets at night. American fighters flew aggressive sweeps far ahead of and alongside the bomber streams. The results were devastating for the Luftwaffe. Nearly 100 German fighter pilots were killed in just 6 days, roughly 15% of the entire day fighter force. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed on the ground and in the air. German aircraft production would eventually recover through dispersal and emergency measures, but the experienced pilots could never be replaced in time to matter. Big Week proved that the aggressive escort doctrine worked. But it was the missions against Berlin itself in the first week of March that broke the Luftwaffe's confidence completely. The first American fighters to reach the German capital did so entirely by accident. On March 3, 1944, P-38, Lightning fighters of the 55th Fighter Group missed a recall signal when deteriorating weather forced the bombers they were escorting to abort and turn back toward England. The fighter pilots, not realizing the bombers had turned around, flew on alone all the way to Berlin and back. They encountered no German fighters over the capital, probably because German air controllers could not believe that unescorted American fighters would fly so deep into the Reich. The mission proved nothing militarily, but it demonstrated that the range problem had been solved. American fighters could reach Berlin. The next day, March 4, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first deliberate bombing attack against the German capital. Approximately 500 bombers took off from English bases with fighter escort that included P-51 Mustangs from both the 4th Fighter Group and the 357th Fighter Group. It was the deepest planned penetration of German airspace, yet attempted with fighter escort all the way to the target. Severe weather scattered most of the bomber formations en route. Only about 30 B-17s from the 3rd Air Division actually bombed Berlin. The 95th Bomb Group earned the historic distinction of being the first American unit to drop bombs on the Nazi capital. Because most bombers never reached the target, losses were relatively light. General Doolittle himself had wanted to lead the Berlin mission personally, flying a P-51 Mustang at the head of the fighter escort. He would have become the only person in history to have led air raids on Tokyo, Rome, and Berlin. General Spaatz initially approved the request, then reversed his decision. Doolittle held detailed classified knowledge of the D-Day invasion plans, scheduled for just a few months later. He could not be permitted to risk capture over Germany. March 6, 1944 was the mission that truly mattered. The day that Göring's interrogators would later ask him about. The day the Luftwaffe began its final decline, the 8th Air Force launched 812 heavy bombers, 563 B-17, flying fortresses, and 249 B-24 Liberators, against 3 industrial targets around Berlin. The primary targets were the VK F-Ball Bearing Factory at Erkner, the Robert Bosch Electrical Equipment Works at Klein-Machnow, and the Daimler-Benz Aero Engine Plant at Genhagen. Fighter escort exceeded 800 aircraft, including 86 P-38 Lightnings, 615 P-47 Thunderbolts, and 100 PT-51 Mustangs. Weather over the targets was poor and bombing results were limited by cloud cover. But the air battle that developed over Germany that day was among the largest and most significant of the entire war. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had against the attacking Americans. 69 bombers were shot down, the highest single-day loss for the 8th Air Force in the entire European war. 11 American fighters were lost as well. The cost was severe, but the cost to the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. P-51 pilots alone claimed 43 German aircraft destroyed. Total German losses that day ranged from 81 to 160 aircraft destroyed depending on the source consulted. More importantly, the losses included irreplaceable, experienced pilots, men with hundreds of hours of combat time, who could never be adequately replaced by the rushed training programs that Germany could still manage in early 1944. One particular action from March 6th illustrates what made the P-51 Mustang so devastating when flown aggressively. The 357th Fighter Group launched 48 Mustangs that morning from their base at Leiston in Suffolk. A navigation error caused by poor weather carried the formation past Berlin, and the group ended up approaching the capital from the east rather than the west. They were coming from the direction of Poland rather than England. This navigational mistake accidentally placed 33 Mustangs directly behind a massive German fighter formation. More than 120 Luftwaffe aircraft, including Messerschmitt 110s, Messerschmitt 410s, and Messerschmitt 109 single-engine fighters, were assembling in the sky east of Berlin to attack the approaching American bombers. The German pilots were focused entirely on the bomber stream ahead of them. They never expected American fighters to appear from behind. Major Tommy Hayes, leading the 357th after the group commander had aborted with mechanical trouble, ordered his pilots to attack immediately. The Mustangs dove into the German formations from dead astern, the perfect position for an ambush. The German pilots never knew what hit them. In the running battle that followed, the 33 American fighters destroyed 20 German aircraft. They did not lose a single Mustang. Captain Clarence Anderson, who would become a triple ace with more than 16 confirmed victories before the war ended, was among the pilots who fought that day. Lieutenant John Howell shot down Oberleutnant Gerhard Luce, a highly decorated German ace with 92 confirmed victories. After this massacre, the Luftwaffe never again used Messerschmitt 110 night fighters in daylight attacks against 8th Air Force bomber formations. The twin-engine aircraft were simply too vulnerable when single-seat fighters could reach the battle. The Berlin missions of early March 1944 initiated a death spiral from which the Luftwaffe never recovered. The mathematics of pilot attrition were relentless and completely merciless. In March 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost 20% of its experienced fighter pilots and 56% of its available fighter aircraft. April was catastrophic beyond anything German planners had anticipated. 489 fighter pilots were killed in a single month, fully 25% of the entire German day fighter force. Training programs produced only 396 replacement pilots during the same period. May saw the losses continue unabated. Between January and June of 1944, 2,262 German fighter pilots died in combat. In just 5 months, the Luftwaffe effectively lost 100% of its day fighter force. The entire establishment of experienced pilots was killed and replaced, in some units multiple times, by progressively less capable replacements rushed through abbreviated training. The great paradox was that German fighter production actually increased dramatically throughout 1944. Albert Speer's factory dispersal program, which moved aircraft production into underground facilities and small workshops spread across Germany, pushed total aircraft production to more than 40,000 units for the year. This total included the labor of up to 90,000 concentration camp prisoners working in brutal conditions. Germany had plenty of aircraft. What Germany did not have was pilots capable of flying them effectively in combat. Average training hours for new German fighter pilots dropped 52%, from 240 hours in 1942 to just 110 hours by 1944. American replacement pilots received between 225 and 350 hours of flight training before entering combat. By July 1944, with rare exceptions, only group and squadron commanders in Luftwaffe fighter units had more than 6 months of combat experience. The majority of German pilots had served somewhere between 8 and 30 days before being killed. The oil campaign that began in May 1944 sealed the Luftwaffe's fate permanently. American bombers systematically targeted Germany's synthetic fuel production facilities, the plants that converted coal into aviation, gasoline, and other petroleum products. Production collapsed from 92,000 barrels per day to just 5,000 barrels by September 1944. By February 1945, German aviation fuel production stood at 0.5% of early 1944 levels. Training became physically impossible. There was no fuel for student pilots to fly. Combat units had to ration every gallon. Hundreds of brand new aircraft sat on dispersal fields throughout Germany with no fuel in their tanks and no qualified pilots to fly them, even if fuel could be found. Galland later called the oil campaign the most important of the say. Combined factors which brought about the collapse of Germany. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, who oversaw German aircraft production, provided an even more direct epitaph for the Luftwaffe. "The British left us with deep and bleeding wounds," he acknowledged after the war. "But the Americans stabbed us in the heart." By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the transformation of the air war was complete. The Allies flew 14,674 combat sorties over Normandy and the English Channel on the first day of the invasion. Luftflotte 3, the German air command responsible for France, managed approximately 320 sorties in response. The ratio was 46-1. The famous story of only 2 German aircraft appearing over the invasion beaches is often repeated but slightly misleading. It refers specifically to Geschwader Commodore Josef Priller and his wingman Heinz Wodarczyk of Jagdgeschwader 26, who strafed Sword and Juno beaches in their Focke-Wulf 190s early on the morning of the invasion. They were the only German pilots to attack the beaches during the initial landings. Several hundred Luftwaffe sorties were actually flown over Normandy on June 6, but against complete Allied air supremacy, they were operationally meaningless. German aircraft that approached the beachhead were shot down or driven off. German reinforcements moving toward the coast had to travel at night or face annihilation from Allied fighter bombers. General Dwight Eisenhower had told his troops on the eve of invasion that if they saw fighter aircraft overhead, those aircraft would be Allied aircraft. He was confident enough in American and British air superiority to stake the success of the entire operation on that promise. German soldiers developed their own bitter joke about the situation. "American planes are grey," they said. "British planes are black." and Luftwaffe planes are invisible. The collapse of the Luftwaffe was not caused by any single factor. It resulted from a convergence of engineering, innovation, doctrinal revolution, industrial might, and the cold mathematics of attrition warfare. But the P-51 Mustang was the essential instrument that made everything else possible. Romanian Messerschmitt 109 pilot Ion Dobran, who rose to the rank of Major General and lived to the age of 102, later described what it was like to fight at bomber altitudes against the new American escorts. At those heights, the Messerschmitts were barely hanging on while the Mustangs maneuvered freely. German ace Günther Rahl, who scored 275 aerial victories and survived the war, flew a captured P-51 after Germany's surrender. He later praised its combination of speed, maneuverability, climb rate, and extraordinary range. What struck him most was how straightforward the aircraft was to fly compared to the German fighters he had mastered. Hermann Göring lived long enough to face justice at Nuremberg. He was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced to death by hanging. On the night before his scheduled execution in October 1946, he killed himself with a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled into his cell. He escaped the hangman, but not the verdict of history. Adolf Galland survived the war despite his conflicts with Göring and the Nazi High Command. After being relieved of his position as General of Fighters in January 1945 for criticizing Luftwaffe leadership too openly, he was allowed to form an elite jet fighter unit, flying Messerschmitt 262 jets during the war's final months. He later served as a consultant to the Argentine Air Force and to various aviation companies. He died in February 1996 at the age of 83, having outlived nearly all of his wartime adversaries and comrades alike. The P-51 Mustangs that changed history are mostly gone now. Of the nearly 15,000 built during the war, only a few hundred survive. Some still fly at air shows around the world, their Merlin engines producing the distinctive sound that once terrified German pilots scrambling to intercept bombers over Berlin. Others rest in museums, from Washington to London to Duxford, the airfield where Ronald Harker first imagined what a Merlin-powered Mustang might achieve. The men who flew them in combat are nearly all gone as well. Captain Clarence Anderson, who fought over Berlin on March 6, 1944, passed away in May 2024 at the age of 102. He was among the last surviving American aces of the European Air War, one of the final living links to that desperate spring when young Americans flew into the heart of Nazi Germany and broke the power of the Luftwaffe. What remains is the record of what they accomplished. In the spring of 1944, American fighter pilots systematically destroyed the German Air Force as an effective fighting organization. They did it in an aircraft that almost was never built, powered by an engine from another country, executing tactics that their own commanders had rejected just months before their implementation. Their victory required engineering innovation on two continents, from Edgar Schmued's revolutionary airframe to Ronald Harker's insight about the Merlin engine. It required leaders willing to change established doctrine when evidence demanded it, men like Doolittle who tore down signs and rewrote the rules. And it required individual courage on a scale that remains difficult to comprehend. Thousands of young men climbing into cockpits day after day, knowing that the odds were against their survival. The story of the Mustangs over Berlin is fundamentally a story about how organizations respond when reality contradicts their assumptions. Göring denied reality, issuing official orders that American fighters were not there, even as their wreckage accumulated on German soil. Doolittle accepted reality, changing tactics within weeks of taking command. The gap between those two approaches decided the outcome of the air war over Europe. When Göring told his American interrogators that the appearance of long-range fighters over Berlin meant the results would be tragic for Germany, he was finally admitting what he had spent more than a year refusing to believe. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated by superior numbers alone. It had been defeated by an aircraft German experts said could not exist, flown by pilots using tactics no one had anticipated, in a battle for air superiority that Germany did not realize had begun until it was already lost.